Hello, welcome to Alec Cizak Television. Today I'm talking with Jim Thomsen, a fiction writer and reviewer, former journalist. We'll hopefully learn about all that. So first of all, Jim, if you could tell my audience who you are and what it is you do.
Okay. I am a writer and editor and a book reviewer, sometimes for pay, sometimes in trades, sometimes just because I want to do it. Um, I make my living primarily as a manuscript editor, and I also work for Amazon. For the last year, I've worked for the Kindle Vella serial storytelling program. And my job there was to go through their fire hose of content and evaluate everything and shine a spotlight on what I thought was the best stuff so they can give it some enhanced marketing. And I'm currently on hiatus from that and working on a novel while I'm on my mandatory 3-month break, which is almost over.
Is that break imposed by Amazon or?
Yeah, the law is that they can't just keep you as a contract worker in perpetuity. Um, I did 2 6-month contracts, and at the end of that, according to my employment agency, they either had to offer me a permanent job or put me on 3 months hiatus, or give me 3 months off and then rehire me at the end of that mandatory 3-month break, which I believe they're going to do. Which is fine with me. I saved up for it, and I wanted the time to write, and so I didn't mind that at all. I would not mind being on contract in perpetuity.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting. I'm not going to say anything about Amazon. How is that Kindle storytelling program? How's that going, if you don't mind my asking? Like, is it?
Based on the volume of submissions, they seem to be drawing a lot of the writers and readers that have made other platforms like Radish and Wattpad successful. This is what I call really hard genre stuff. A lot of space operas and erotic fantasy and alpha werewolves and bad boy billionaires. These people write to very specific tastes. It's like the people who write like Harry Potter fan fiction or whatever. There's an audience for every fetish or niche out there, and these people know how to write to it, to feed it, and find their audience. So, and apparently there's some good money to be made in there. That it's like regular publishing where the top 1 or 2% really rake it in, and everybody else is chasing that dream.
Is that fiction any good, if you don't mind my asking?
I would say the majority of it is mediocre, and some of it's all but unreadable. But there are some real gems in there, and that was part of what made the job fun was finding these people who didn't have any particular profile and being able to go to my superiors and saying, hey, this is a terrific story in a genre that appears to have a wide audience. Let's give this person a chance to reach a wider audience and maybe make a living at this. And so I don't take any pleasure. I don't bury the stuff that doesn't work. I just simply don't promote it. But I'm able to have some influence. I'm like Tim Robbins in The Player. I can't. I can kick. I don't have a unfettered green light, but I can kick a good pitch up the chain, and but I also can't really stop an idea completely in its tracks either. I'm sort of I'm a player. I'm a link in a big chain.
Okay. Well, you talked about, I forgot about I should have mentioned you're an editor. I apologize for that.
All right.
But you talk about writing fiction. How has your experience as a journalist informed your fiction writing?
Well, first of all, it taught me to write tight and master the declarative form of sentence writing before I take on the more complicated forms. Um, and know what to leave out and leave the stuff that readers aren't interested in on the floor. You know, in journalism, you have to both as a writer, I have to, you know, often I'm given, you know, like give me your best 15 column inches on this subject. So I have to really exercise some internal editing before I even goes to a copy editor about what the best 15 inches is. And then as a copy editor, I've been on the other end of that funnel, and I often call writers over and saying, hey, do we really need quotes from all three of these people? Will just one or two of them suffice if they're saying basically the same thing? That sort of thing. So just yeah, in fiction writing, probably your truest asset is knowing what not to put in. No setups, no throat clearing, um, no expositional wanderings. And journalism is like the Aberdeen proving ground for that. It's boot camp.
Okay, that's pretty good. You read and review a lot of crime fiction. Speaking of things that shouldn't be there, what are some things that need to be retired from crime fiction?
Well, as you well know, I sort of my avatar for all of that is the trope of the shoulder wound. You know, people in crime fiction are constant heroes in crime fiction are constantly getting shot in extraneous limbs very conveniently, and they usually, you know, grimace a little bit and then go on kicking ass and shooting accurately and winning hand-to-hand combat actions, and it's all, you know, readers may forgive it, but to me it's just, you know, you're a creator, create something original that you can be proud of. Don't just try to provide pallid fan service. You know, and plus I think the more we know, the more we're an information society, the harder it is to get away with the idea that the shoulder is somehow a fluffy, friendly pincushion for bullets and isn't full of nerve bundles and delicate joints and bone and hard tissue that can take can, you know, a wound to that area can debilitate you forever or even permanently disable you. And I've known, as a cops and courts reporter early in my journalism career, I've seen the results of those, and I've seen people who can't lift their arm above their elbow anymore. Um, and You know, and I realize crime fiction, you get a certain leeway in the interests of, you know, dramatic tension, but that's kind of my avatar for all the cliches of the genre, like you know, the alcoholic cop or the man who uses a missing girl or a dead girl as a way of discovering new things about himself, or you know, any number of tropes like that. I I review a lot of those books because I feel like there's not a lot of honesty in the crime fiction community, because I feel like their first priority is to, you know, promote themselves and each other, you know, to promote their friends, to sort of punch up and get people they perceive to be higher up in the crime community food chain interested in them and pleased with them. And so I think there's a lot of like, there's a lot of reviews that basically say, "Hey, wonderful book, great guy, whatever," and don't really say anything honest about what is actually in the book. If there's one fault in the crime fiction community, in my opinion, it's that it makes no distinction between a good person and a good book by that person. And you know, there's some great people out there, and some of them unfortunately write books that aren't that good. I I try to write reviews that don't just, slap them down, but point out, that show my work. And if they're overwritten or they're implausible or cliched, I will show examples of that. And my goal is not to, create controversy or hurt people, but to say, hey, writing a book is, once you put a book out into the world, it belongs to me, the reader, and I've got something to say about it. And this isn't, releasing a book into the world doesn't mean that the author's entitled to tongue bathing in perpetuity, just because people are there to make friends and bask in a kind of circle jerk of positive affirmation.
Do you think the online condition that has altered? I mean, in the 1990s, I've been writing my whole life, but I started sending stuff out in the 1990s before the internet was everywhere, before the internet was how you did things.
I did that too.
Yeah, there was no writing community. Like, I knew a few other writers, and every now and then we try to get together a group just to help each other with constructive criticism and whatnot. But not like today, where it's almost a cult, don't you think? Like, and I wonder, does this, because there really is a lot of focus on, is the writer a good person or not? My question is, what the fuck does that matter? Like, does it really matter if you're not having dinner with the writer? You're reading something that, like you said, like once it's out, I totally agree with you. Once a book is out there, that does not belong to the writer anymore. So what does the writer matter? Is this focus? Because I mean, I see agents and publishers suddenly concerned about this. Oh, we don't want to publish somebody, who the cool kids don't like. Is this, in the long run, is this going to hurt the quality of fiction that's out there?
Well, I think we see it. I only, as much as I read and review, and I do it very prolifically, I only see a small percentage of what comes out. And there's a lot of dreck out there. And I think a lot of that happens because there are people with a lot of friends who want to see them succeed, who have a little bit of influence, and together amount to at least a moderate amount of influence. And publishing is a world of relationships. And I think sometimes people who don't deserve to be published get published because they are plugged into relationships that have a power dynamic that affect others in the chain. And sometimes it's better to keep somebody happy by keeping their friends happy. And I think that's maybe it's foolish and naive of me to think it should all be about a good book, and not necessarily one that's derivative, written to the market, or is top heavy with blurbs from the same people they drink with at the BoucherCon hotel bar.
Mm-hmm. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I before we get too far away from some stuff you said earlier, with regards to the shoulder wound issue, I know exactly what you're talking about, and a lot of, especially like if you read like Jack Reacher, which is not really independent, but these heroes, they do seem indestructible, and I'm just curious, is this because the storytelling tradition is so heavily rooted in myth, where the heroes in mythology were all but untouchable, and so for, like, if you've read your Joseph Campbell, right, that mythology it's crucial to our psychological well-being. If we, like, the more realistic we make our protagonists, are we going to cause some sort of problem psychologically if we no longer have these indestructible heroes?
Well, I think both should exist, but they should exist in separate spheres. I think the people who write what I call fan service fiction of indestructible heroes and, well-worn mythological types, um, you know, who write to reader expectations ought to be completely in a separate sphere of influence from people who who write stories of crime that invert and subvert tropes and expectations and strive to create art and use prose and are not necessarily anti-commercial, but are writing to tell a good story and to say something about the state of the world above all else. And being published would be, the topper on that, as opposed to the validator that makes your art worthwhile or not. So I would just like to see, I in my perfect world, the people who write series crime fiction and the people who write serious crime fiction should be like on separate continents. I don't understand how those people mix together. And I think that the fact that people try and blend those two together because there's so many interrelationships leads to the problem of publishers having to choose between serious art and more commercially minded stuff that falls into line among well-worn grooves, if that makes any sense.
Well, it makes sense to me, but you think that what is it? Is it the big four or the big five now? Like, how many are left of the big super duper
Four, I think.
publishers? Yeah, how many of them do you think are grappling with the issue of art versus commerce?
Well, I think it's sort of it's a question of how they are versus how they like to think of themselves. I think everybody in publishing likes to think of themselves as an artist, but I think if they're in the quiet places that they don't publicly admit to, if they're capable of being fully honest with themselves, there's part of them that just wants to make a lot of money off a story that's a lot like a, a story before that and a story that before that. Um, and so I think there's a lot of people who wrestle with that within themselves and within their communities, and I think that's what causes a lot of the conflict in those communities, is that the blatantly commercial imperative collides with the artistic imperative, and there are people who think they can put those all together, and once in a while it does happen. So but mostly it doesn't. I recently read a series detective novel by a guy who's, I won't name him, but he's very prolific and popular on Twitter and Facebook. And it was a tough read for me because it checked every cliche and trope in the private eye book, but you could see that the guy had a higher gear if only he would choose to engage it. Every once in a while, he would drift off into some deeper character exploration. And I could just see the two sides of him at war with himself and him ultimately bending to the cliches. And to me, that's sort of a microcosm of what's going on.
Okay, we could talk about that for an hour, I think.
Yeah.
Before I get to the next prepared question, you said that you used to work the crime and police beat, and so I wonder if you could tell us just a few things that you've seen in your experience in that field that you constantly see crime writers getting wrong.
Oh, okay. Let's see. I think a lot of it has to do with the speed at which things happen. Once things enter a sphere of officialdom, everything grinds to a halt, or not to a halt, but it falls to a snail's pace. You know, there's very little racing a clock to meet a deadline for a filing or a hearing, because those cans are constantly kicked down the road, and often, to the point where you don't even know how they resolve, because so many delays and so many continuances later. You're covering other stories, and there's just very little resolution, in that sphere. The other thing is that, well, how would I put it? One of the common cliches in crime fiction is that the media is adversarial. We're just trying to get what we can get, as as expedient as possible. And we're not the enemy. We're not trying to sensationalize. We've got 9 things to juggle at any given time, and we're just trying to get the job done as expeditiously as possible. We're not. I have never seen like a crowd of reporters with tape recorders and cameras on the courthouse steps screaming insensitive questions at people coming out of the courthouse. That doesn't happen. I think the media is an easy punching bag, and in that part of my career, I've had people treat me that way, from police detectives and prosecuting attorneys and so forth. But most of them have been like, they understand that I've got a job to do, they've got a job to do. Sometimes those jobs align with each other, and sometimes they're in conflict, but we're going to be dealing with each other today and the next day and the day after that, and we treat each other as professionals. But I understand that makes for boring storytelling.
Okay, that's a very good insight there. I'm pretty sure I've probably bashed the media a few times.
Yeah, well, everybody needs a strong man to punch, and we pretty much volunteer to be kicked. So I get it.
Well, I would like to say in my defense very quickly, what the media that I bashed and cool it down was television media, and television media. I mean, when you talk about MSNBC or Fox News, or CNN even, it has morphed into this kind of entertainment that I think has nothing to do with journalism. So I understand the difference.
Right. They have to scare the shit out of you to get readers' attention. They have to engage a primal emotion, and if they have to jack things up to do that.
Well, I don't know that the print media does that, but I know
No.
that if I turn on MSNBC or
Mhm.
Fox or CNN, what you get is somebody says, "Oh, isn't this terrible?" And then, "Oh, here's our panelist. Here's so and so from Harvard University. Do you think this is terrible?" "Oh, yes. This is." If I had to come up with a word for this, terrible would be. It's just 5 people sitting around agreeing on a point of view. And to call that news, like Fox News should not be called news. MSNBC, I don't think I guess they do call themselves news. I don't know, but
Yeah.
CNN should definitely not be called news anymore. So
Mhm.
anyway, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but like, I don't think I really bash print media.
No, you don't.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I understand reporters. I used to be a journalist, so I understand that.
Yeah. I'm talking more at the local community level,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just, I'm not, I don't have time to think about liberal bias. I've got to bang out 10 inches on the story before going to the Chamber of Commerce lunch, then going to the county commissioners meeting, then covering that 3-car rollover accident. It never ends, and I don't have time to think about how I'm going to twist it for some imaginary agenda.
Well, to address the issue of whether or not there's a liberal bias, I don't think that the average journalist can express some sort of social Darwinian point of view in a piece of journalism. I don't think that would be good for that person's career. It probably wouldn't make for good reading.
No.
Um, so
And I wouldn't have a bit of respect for myself if I was just a water carrier for somebody else's viewpoint, and nobody I worked with would feel that way either.
yeah, I don't know I don't know. I'm not really, the
Another
idea.
rabbit hole we could fall down all day.
Yeah, the idea of liberal and conservative at this point to me kind of just doesn't mean anything. So
Yeah,
I
I'm
don't
not. I'm not interested in politics except as sort of, um, handy background conflict for a more personal type of storytelling.
Yeah. Um, but so we talked about things that we could see less of in crime fiction. What are some things that we should see more of in crime fiction?
Um, I would like to see more. More moral shades of gray, fewer people who are black and white. But you know, most of us have some badness in us. Most of us have some goodness in us, and I know it's tougher to write a good story about people who live in that gray center. But I think it's a socially enlightening, realistic form of storytelling that I see I see often enough in published work to wish there were a lot more of it, and not just cardboard villains and Mary Sues and saints, or getting back to series crime fiction. So some of the characters, some of the heroes are so ridiculously front loaded. Like there was a time when I used to read a lot of those Lucas Davenport stories by John Sanford, and then at a certain point it was like, give me a break. This guy is handsome, he's rich, everybody loves him. Every woman takes off her clothes for him. He never misses a clue, always gets the bad guy. It's like, the writing is good, but the character is so ridiculously infallible that I lost interest in what was good about the writing, because it was devoid of tension, and the villains were the complete polar opposite. They were all bad and nothing in between. And it drives me crazy that there's so many readers in the genre that are satisfied with that, who I'm confident would accept the challenge of morally gray characters if they would just open themselves to it. But maybe that's just so I'm gonna try and do that in the fiction I write, and I seek it out in what I read. But it's not my mission to educate the world as to what I think they ought to read. So I quietly seethe about it, but I don't waste a lot of my Twitter breath on it.
Well, that certainly I've been watching a lot of the old Siskel and Ebert movie reviews from like the 70s and
Oh, I
80s,
love those.
80s. They very much, and I know there's two separate things, books and movies, but they very much thought it was their job to tell the audience what they should and shouldn't watch.
Right. Well, and that tells you about the different time they had. Back then, because of the limited media reach into flyover America, especially. Most households had 3 or 4 channels. They got their daily newspaper, which both those guys wrote for, and they were in a unique position to set the agenda. And honestly, if I were in their position, I'd probably be more of a moralist and a polemicist too. I would not be able to resist the impulse to power that they gave themselves over to. Because when you believe you're right, it also comes with the feeling that you have to share that feeling of rightness with the world. So which And if you have the megaphone for it, I think it's hard to resist, to stand down from that. That said, I love the fact that those two haven't constantly argued over that. So, you got more than one viewpoint in the process, and B, they were entertaining as hell about it. And C, the best takeaway was usually an amalgam of their points of view rather than one being completely right and the other completely being wrong. And I remember watching those and kind of like synthesizing their points into my own opinion, even as a kid, and feeling, intellectually massaged for that exercise.
Yeah, it was. What's fascinating is that you can never predict who was going to like what.
Right.
There's a famous, very famous clip of them talking about Blue Velvet, where Ebert, who usually, if something was perverted in any way, Ebert loved it. But that movie he was furious about, and Siskel was the one that had to tell him. He said, "Hey, we're going into new territory. That's sometimes it's not comfortable."
Right.
It's fascinating, but there are other reviews where Ebert had to tell Siskel that. It's very strange. They're
I probably read every review Roger Ebert's ever written, and yeah, you're right. Every once in a while, he would. One particular instance that comes to mind is the movie Fast Times at Ridgemont High, 1982, and he gave it like no stars because he was so offended that the filmmakers made Jennifer Jason Leigh, 15 years old, show her breasts and have sex and have humiliating sex in the movie. He could not get past that and see the movie beyond that, and he had to tell the world about it.
Well, I think time has proven that that assessment. I don't want to say inaccurate, but questionable.
Right.
Yeah. So let's get back to the discussion. You said you're an editor.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering what are some editing tips you can offer writers, and I'll expand on this or expound on it a little bit. That will speed up the revision and editing process. I ask this question because I'm always my revision process is painstakingly long and drawn out. And I find like in the seventh or eighth draft, I find something that I want to slap myself and say, why didn't you see this the first time you went through this?
It's hard to get distance on your own work.
Well, I'll give you one of my biggest pet peeves is repetition of words or phrases for a non-stylistic reason. So the brain likes music, and repetition is part of music. So you'll see in a paragraph like the phrase, uh, as though, right? As though, and then the very next paragraph, like the first sentence, again, you use as though in revision or editing, even, right? That's not even revision, that's editing. That should be fixed. But it's like it doesn't matter how many times, and even after the story gets published, I read it and I'll catch one of those, and I'm like, oh God, how did I miss that? So yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just wonder if you had any tricks like that to help, to kind of see more in one reading.
Okay. I do. Over the years, I've learned to ask clients certain questions before they send their manuscript, and one of them is I said, "Tell me the length of your manuscript," and usually it's at a slightly unwieldy length, like 120,000 words. And I always hark back to something my dad, who did taxes and financial planning, used to say. He would say, when you're planning a budget, you can always take 10% off the top of anything. So I would say, make your manuscript 10% shorter, and I bet you can find a way to do it painlessly by nipping and tucking superfluous descriptions of weather or scenery or household decor or characters' looks. Um, do you have any background info dumps in there that are more than about 4 lines in a paragraph? You can cut those down or redistribute them elsewhere. Um, and Another thing I ask is, does the story start where it starts? Because what I often come across is a lot of what I call, well, before I can tell you the story, I have to explain the story to you. I have to set it up for you through an unwieldy prologue or an exposition heavy first chapter in which, I started off with somebody waking up and brushing their teeth and looking at themselves in the mirror and then falling into the rabbit hole of memory. And so what I've learned to say is, does your story really start at chapter 3 or 4, or does it actually start at chapter 1? And then I will, I'll give them a version of that spiel that I just told you. Are you having somebody get out of bed and pour cornflakes for their kids and, engage in trite dialogue in those crucial early pages when you need to hook a reader or risk seeing them wander away for good? And I also want them to, I generally don't want to be the only other person to look at a manuscript. I feel like a serious person has, not only put their manuscript in a drawer for a few weeks or a month or so to get some distance on it so that their eyes can be fresh to it for revision, but I want them, I think it's helpful to have somebody else who's a trusted reader who will not bullshit you and check you on some things that you're not capable of checking yourself on. So I generally ask them if they've done those things. If they don't, I may still take them on, but it tells me something about the readiness of their manuscript going into the job I do for them. It's better for them and better for me if it's as ready as possible, but some people just need to get it off their plate for their own sanity and put it in their editor's hands. And I get that too. Unfortunately, that means, it's more work and the job costs more. But if that's all understood going in, then, nobody gets an unpleasant surprise. And I generally, read it over and say, there's a lot of work to do here, and here's a summary of the challenges, and now I'm going to really dive in and flag like whole pages that can be cut, and repetitious phrases, like you said. Another thing I commonly see is characters who all speak in the same voice, to the point of using the same idiomatic language. So that's another pre-question I ask is, do these characters all have individual voices and personalities, or are they all kind of, cut from the same Jello mold? And I've had clients who've been able to take those questions, go back to their work with that fresh eye because of those questions, and be able to give me a slightly more ready to edit manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, I'll work with anything that's not just a first draft. I don't want to see anybody's vomit draft. That's for the writer alone, and there should be at least one round of revision between that and somebody else beating your pain to work on your book.
Yeah. Okay, that's good stuff. We're about ready to wrap things up here, but let me just ask you these last questions here. So I noticed you have an interest in fiction and nonfiction about the 1970s, and I wonder if you could tell us what about that decade you find fascinating.
Well, part of it is my age. I'm 57 years old, which means I entered the 1970s as a 4-year-old and exited as a 14-year-old. So I lived that decade in kind of its granular detail with, Bubble Yum and Wacky Packages and Crack Magazine and Top 40 Radio. But I didn't really understand the wider forces shaping that time. And as a result, I think, I think we all kind of revisit our formative years to some degree, and I do that in a very scholarly way by trying to understand, like I can remember long lines at the gas pump, but I didn't really understand, the Arab oil embargo and everything that went into that, or the inflation and stagflation of the late 70s, and how that meant that, dad didn't have as much work because his clients were government contractors, whose jobs were canceled, and all of a sudden I couldn't get, my bike fixed or a new pair of shoes. Um, our family our fortunes rose and fell on the global economy. So anyway, that, and I've always loved the music and the art. I think the films made between about 1970 and 1975 are some of the finest out there, because it was the auteur era. And some people ran aground on their hubris in that era, but others made some really incredible art, and there's some great crime films made in that are not necessarily Chinatown or Night Moves or the ones that are commonly referred to.
Mhm.
And in general, it's just, to me, it's a time in which a person could get lost and stay lost. And there was a sense of an individual versus a changing definition of community in the wake of the collapse of the counterculture of the 60s. Everybody was trying to figure, the 70s, it was a time in which everybody was trying to figure out what, everything would look like, from the most basic things to the biggest things: church, community, cultural standards. Everything was up for grabs at that time. And so it created all sorts of useful intentions that I think manifest themselves in the crime fiction of the time. I think of like Newton Thornburg, or, gosh, I'm blanking out now. But Newton Thornburg is a great example. Cutter and Bone, and To Die in California, and Black Angus. Anyway, it's just, to me, it represents a sort of engaged freedom that we don't have now, because back then, to do anything, you had to go to, if you wanted to research something, you had to go to a library or to a government building or to an academic resource. You couldn't do anything online. You had to engage with people. You had to create relationships. You had to build alliances. And those things developed character for people in a way that I think newer generations, who can just sort of, skip seeing people in person, can get away with. I like the shoe leather aspect of living that the 70s embodies. And so in the novel I'm writing, I've created a character who's staring down the barrel at his 50th birthday, and he decides the only way to deal with the diarrhea rodeo that is 2021 is to pretend like he's in 1971. So he gets rid of all his social media, kills his entire online footprint. And my character is a guy who wrote ebooks. So he basically decided to kill that part of his career, and he decided to go on this crusade against his hometown, which was gentrifying from a sort of 1970s mill town into more of a tourist resort town. And he decides he's going to single-handedly put a stop to that. That's the way he's going to make a mark in a life that's otherwise disappointed him by his own standards. And he's going to, single-handedly force this town to bend to his fantasy. And then there are people who, are sort of a Greek chorus of, hey, you know what, you're really being kind of silly. And I understand it's romantic, but it's really stupid and harmful at the same time. So all viewpoints, the fantasy and the reality, are represented. And I find I'm really enjoying unpacking the myths of the 70s and, fetishizing them at the same time.
The That sounds fascinating. Is that a literary book or a crime book?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I'm calling it crime fiction because it's definitely it fits that mold structurally in some ways. Um, but yeah, it's got a lot of thematic ambition. If there's one weakness, there's a lot of what I call talking to the camera, a lot of speechifying that I'm trying to cut down in revision, so it doesn't sound so breaking the fourth wallish.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I'm trying to uh, me and others are trying to expand crime fiction in ways that it hasn't been, and so I like to hear that. It sounds like a very interesting book. So I look forward to seeing that in the future. Do you,
Yeah.
do you think there are any lessons from the 1970s that we might come in handy in this era?
Just deal with people in person. I think it's
Mm.
you know when people interact face to face and transact face to face, it's you know it always makes people better people than if they're just um, you know talking like you and I are talking. I mean, there's a form to this, but you and I have sat across from each other in a bar and had a conversation like this, and as satisfying as that is, I like the memory of that because there was a texture to that get together that by by definition is missing from this one, even though the words are still there, but there's just something about you know uh, the way people express themselves in body language with the ambient atmosphere around you that makes everything richer and deeper in my mind.
Yeah. Now we met in Missoula at
Yes.
the I forget what the name of the restaurant is, but they have the best fried chicken in Missoula. What's
Oh,
funny
it was
is
it was the bomb. Yeah.
uh, today I don't eat chicken because I raise chickens now, and I better not raise pigs or I'll be done with meat completely. I don't raise cows, but I'm not a fan of beef. Um, it's neither here nor there, but it's interesting because I think about that conversation. I'm like, yeah, today we would have probably met at the pizza joint because
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I would have had a big old greasy burger back then. Today I'm a Beyond Burger guy
yeah,
because now I it in part because of all the reading I've done about how everything happened in the 70s. I now know more about like slaughterhouse culture than I I did before, and there's no going. You can't eat something in good conscience or feel or aesthetically feel good about it. Um, and that's part of the beauty of the 70s. The 70s allowed things to exist on myth and apocrypha. Kids could still tell each other you know urban legends and make other kids believe them because there was no way to verify it. And
Mhm.
there's kind of a fun, you know, like Fletch, the character played by Chevy Chase, who came of age in the 70s in a series of great novels by Gregory MacDonald. His whole shtick was he got away with everything because nobody could verify anything he said. He could not live for 2 seconds in the internet era. But I think we're better off for having this creative bullshitter who created some fantastic stories along the way and was able to get away with it because there was uh, that's the way the world was wired at the time.
I read the first Fletch book, and what I remember about it is it seems like every paragraph was one line long.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the commercial appeal too. But yeah, it's an acquired taste. It's not my all time favorite, but I think of it in terms of, you know, a character that could exist then but not now. You know, first of all, he wouldn't have a newspaper to work at because there are practically almost no more newspapers. But second of all, you know, people would just check him out. They would Google everything he said and call him on his bullshit in 2 seconds.
Yeah, well, I don't see. I like Fletch. I like the book. It always struck me that because Stephen King, in his book on writing, which everybody now considers the Bible, like on writing seems to have replaced elements of style, which
not quite. To me, it's entertaining. I don't regard it as academic.
well, I'll tell you, in the early 2000s, when that book was first released, for about 10 years, you didn't see any adverbs in fiction. They were gone. They were gone. So people take Stephen King very seriously. They should, because he's done this for a long time. Yeah, I find his prose a little bit glacial, but he knows what he's talking about. But
and he had that kind of influence. Reminds me of the movie Sideways. When Paul Giamatti says, "I'm not drinking any fucking Merlot," he killed that varietal for almost a decade. Wow. Because people thought of it as, like, you know, the wine for people who didn't appreciate wine.
Well, Stephen, in that book on writing, Stephen King says, and I used to think this was a really snotty thing to say, but he said, "Oh, look at the paragraphs in a book, and if there are not too many sentences in a paragraph, this writer obviously doesn't have anything to say." And I love Stephen King, but it's like, dude, you know, you made your living recrafting old Twilight Zone plots, you know, like maybe don't talk too much about meaningful paragraphs, but
yeah, and he came of age in a time where, you know, audiences were more captive to his kind of work. You know, when Carrie was published, like, what, 1974, he wasn't competing with video games or YouTube or anything else for anybody's attention, so he could afford to be expansive. And, you know, he built his brand name during that time, and that's carried forward into the current time. But that doesn't mean that, you know, it's a ladder other people can climb because they're not writing to a 1974 audience.
And in fairness, Stephen, you know, a lot of those early Stephen King books were very influential on me. He did a lot of things that were, I thought, unconventional for commercial books. Carrie, for instance, you know, is presented. It's got a narrative, but it's also like a documentary. There's like newspaper articles and whatnot put into it. And Christine, we talked about on Twitter. Christine, like, just suddenly shifts the POV in the middle when the main character's in the hospital.
Oh yeah, it has a 3-act structure. It is really remarkable. It inverts a lot of conventional wisdom in that regard. Especially with its shifting point of view from Dennis to let's see, second act was more omniscient,
right?
And
and then back to Dennis.
Yeah, and yet you know, that's not a choice very many people would have made, and yet it was the perfect choice. He has that uncanny instinct for what works.
Yeah. One other thing, you were talking about things that you remember from the 70s. I think my favorite, because I was a little kid in the 70s, my favorite thing was that would not happen today. It was all the kids loaded into the back of a pickup truck and flying the highway, right?
Oh my God.
You know,
never happened now.
65 miles an hour, and you're bouncing, and you're just wondering, oh, is this the trip where I fly out onto the side of the highway? But it was just what you did.
Yeah, we were free range kids back then. I mean, we had woods behind our neighborhood that, you know, and in the summer, all the moms kicked their kids out after breakfast and didn't want to see them till lunchtime, and then they didn't want to see them till dinner. So, you know, we could have easily been, you know, kidnapped by creeps in the woods, and they would have gotten a 4-hour head start before our parents would start to get curious. And I don't think that happens much anymore.
Yeah. Something else you mentioned, you talked about the difference between like a face-to-face conversation and like an online conversation, or the worst of them all, an exchange on Twitter. I just wonder, do you think this is part of like there seems to be a move, and this now we're going to head kind of into science fiction territory, but kind of a move towards what they used to call post-biological existence. The elimination of interaction, real interaction between you. Do you think that? Because I have this theory that what's really happening right now is we're being turned into circuits or a machine. Like human beings are, it's not batteries. It's not like the Matrix, but all these efforts to make everybody kind of think the same and be the same, the exact same, and not have any deviant opinions of any kind. It seems to me that it's only in the service of turning us into some kind of machine or some sort of uh, piece of a machine. What do you think? Do you think is that fair, or am I just being paranoid and outrageous?
Well, I think the tools of manipulation to make people into those things are definitely much more in place with each passing year. I think there's a perverse oppositionality to a lot of uh, it, to human nature in a lot of us that will always resist that. At least, I think as long as I'm alive, I think that resistance will carry the day. But they're all constant. But I think in general, yes, we are trending toward more automatonic human beings.
Uh, do you do you think so? So we have at least two generations now that don't know a world without social media.
Mm.
At least one generation just has no concept of a world without social media. So what you're talking about, I understand, like the resistance to any kind of push towards complete uniformity.
Mm.
The upcoming generations, do they have that resistance?
Um, I don't think so, because I think, their parents will be the people who were raised on social media. And so I think they bring a limited um, sense of, their free range selves to the rearing of that generation. And I think there'll be a successive generation effect of lessening individuality as a result.
So when you and we pass off the mortal coil, and there aren't stubborn old bastards like us talking about stuff, um, it won't even be missed.
Probably not. Um, I try not to get too depressed about that, but I think that's the reality. Um, I think I wish I'd made more of a mark at a time where it was possible to make a broader mark. Like in my 20s, and it was possible to grab an audience share of the universe, like with a debut novel that is less possible now. But I'm still going to try and do my part. I feel like one of the most valuable things an author or someone who wants to become an author has in their toolkit is their debut author card, because publishers are still giving big deals to people without a track record who bring an attractive high concept to them. And I still have that card in my in reserve. And so I deliberately wanted to create a first work that is a talker, what we used to call a water cooler conversation book, if water coolers and people talking around water coolers are still a thing. But, you know, I figured, you know, if I can entertain and provoke conversation equal measure, that's the best I can contribute to, to counter the growing homogenization of the world. And that's what I hope to do with this book if it ever finds a place in the world.
Right. Well, that's a good point. That's a ship I think that sailed for me. But I feel like see, to us, the idea of complete uniformity is immoral. I mean, not in the Christian sense, but just in the human sense, it's immoral. To deny, because when I complain a lot about conformity and the idiots on Twitter and whatnot, but I meet these people individually. In conversation, I will meet individuals. Everybody is an individual when you sit down and talk to them.
Mm.
But if you have just a systematic working that out of the human psyche, if you will, for those generations down the road, it will not be immoral. In fact, they will probably speak of conversations like this as immoral. This
Yeah.
or immoral for thinking, you know, for believing in the idea of individuality. It's individuality is where I separate with Joseph Campbell. I agree with him about everything else, but he very much was into collectivism. He believed that, we're all part of a system, that we serve this greater good, which I kind of agree with, but it's not everything. And like I said, I really believe that everybody is, you really find quirks with people when you can separate them from the herd and talk to them. You find, they have just the strangest, hobbies and obsessions. But if it's not known, it's not immoral. I'm fascinated by this idea of when humanity does become just a series of circuits in a larger machine. I wish I could see it.
I really hope that in literature a Ray Bradbury type emerges who tackles all these problems and puts them into grand entertainment.
Yeah. Well, I don't know though. I mean, do people really listen? Do they really listen? We've had so many great books that warned us, and here we are.
It's true. I mean, and now we have the ability to seamlessly filter out anything that isn't confirmation bias input. I can set all my phone and computer and news filters to stuff that just reinforces my existing worldview. And if that worldview were created by other people who had who were encouraged to embrace their more automatonic selves, then you know I'd be that much less of a free range thinker, which I think is why I hark back so hard to the 70s, because to me it's such an era of individual versus society, and I find such intrigue in the useful tension between those two axes. I think you need the community and you need the individual, and you need those things to stand apart to a certain degree to be at their most functional.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, I was going to ask you what we can expect from you in the future, but I think you told us you're working on.
Yeah, and I'm also working on a couple of like smaller, more commercial thriller novellas that are more YA for the serial story market. Those will be published under pen names, but I'm having a lot of fun with those too. So there's speaking of all the schisms and dichotomies, I don't want to put all my eggs in this one very personal project that may or may not be commercial. I still want to make a little bit of money off my creativity, so I've come up with some really not tropey, but stuff that based on my serial story reading, meets audience expectations to some degree, and yet satisfies me.
Okay. Sounds great. We'll look for them. We'll try to figure out which pseudonym is yours.
Okay, that'll be fun.
Okay. Well, thanks for talking to us, and we'll have
All
to
right.
actually, I guess later on when you're done with some of these projects, we'll have you back, and we'll talk some more.
Deal. Thanks so much, Alex. It's very stimulating.
Yes, it's a good conversation.
All right. Take care, man.